So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kadeem Morris. I'm an attorney here at Community Legal Services in the Housing Unit. Welcome back to Tenant Tuesdays at 2, our weekly conversation on topics relating to tenants and housing in Philadelphia. Tenant Tuesdays at 2 is made possible by the Philadelphia Eviction Prevention Project, a collaborative effort between the City of Philadelphia, City Council, CLS, Senior Law, Turn, Philadelphia VIP, and Clarify to basically bring resources and services to tenants throughout Philadelphia as they seek to navigate the housing process with the larger goal of eviction prevention. Each week we will cover a different topic, so come back weekly to learn more. You can also go to phillytenant.org for personalized advice or resources and to find links for possible representation. Joining me this week is Kay Greenberg. He is a staff attorney here in the Housing Unit at Community Legal Services. We are also joined by Sterling Johnson. They're the Director of Enforcement at the Fair Housing Rights Center. Today's conversation will be split in two parts. The first part of the program will focus on the city's new COVID-19 rental assistance program, which is designed to help vulnerable tenants who may be impacted by loss of income due to COVID-19. And then we will continue on the trend of COVID-19 and have a conversation on reasonable accommodations in housing in the face of COVID-19 with Sterling Johnson from the Fair Housing Rights Center. Spanish translation is available if you are joining us via Zoom. You can click on the translation option or the interpretation option at the bottom, and it will give you the option to listen in Spanish. This video is also being recorded in both Spanish and English and will be made available later. So just briefly, I want to go through some updates. Per the last order, the municipal courts are closed until at least June 1st. The governor has issued a new order which basically prevents any new eviction filings from being filed before July 10th, 2020. And that, along with the CARES Act moratorium, which basically prevents tenants who are in subsidized housing or whose landlords receive federal subsidies through their mortgages from having cases filed against them for non-payment of rent at least until July 25th of 2020. So that's kind of a staggered moratorium from when the courts open to when new filings can take place. The Fair Housing Commission is currently accepting complaints from tenants. You can file those online. I just want to give a brief update on our contact information. The housing unit here at CLS is working remotely. If you are having a housing related issue and you would like access to legal services, feel free to call 267-443-2500 and you can have your questions answered and do an intake with one of our housing staffers. The Fair Housing Rights Center, represented today by Sterling Johnson, can be reached at 215-625-0700. So with those brief announcements and housekeeping matters, we're gonna dive right into today's presentation. And I'm gonna invite Kay Greenberg to give us a brief overview of the city's new COVID-19 rental assistance program.
Okay, hi everyone. So as Kadeem mentioned, my name's Kay. I'm an attorney at Community Legal Services, and I'm just here to talk to you a little bit about the COVID-19 Emergency Rental Assistance Program that just went live today. And the applications are only live through Saturday, May 16th, 2020 at 5 p.m. So tell your friends. I am putting a link to the applications in the chat on both Facebook and on Zoom, so people can use it to access the application. So the application is available in many different languages. When you go to this website, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can change what language it's in. It both changes the language for the kind of informational part of the website as well as the application itself. For people who do not have access to a computer, like I said, if you're watching this, you probably do, but call your friends. You can call 311 to apply. Just a warning, I actually tried to test that this morning and there were 30 people ahead of me. So if you do this, be prepared to wait and make sure that you leave enough bubble time as the applications again end Saturday, May 16th at 5 p.m. So what can you get through this program? You can get up to 3 months, you can get 3 months of rental assistance, up to $2,500 total. So basically the program works that it provides 3 months of rent. And again, that maxes out at 2,500. After the first 3 months, if there is additional funding, they may extend for another 3-month period up to 1 year. So essentially, the application now is for the initial 3 months, but it may actually continue for up to a year. Only one application per rental unit. What that means is if you live with a roommate and you are on the same lease, you can only apply as one. If you have 2 separate leases, each separate lease can apply. And again, this is limited funds. They're going to distribute this money until they run out. If they have too many applicants for the amount of money that they have right now, people will be selected via lottery. So just because you meet the qualifications that I'm going to go into is not necessarily a guarantee that you're going to get the money that you're applying for. So first, just to touch on the eligibility requirements. So what criteria do you need to meet to have access to this program? First of all, you need to rent an apartment or a house in Philadelphia. This is a Philadelphia County specific program. You need to have a written lease signed by your landlord. It doesn't need to be from this year. For example, if you moved into a place in 2008 and have been living there since then, that lease, under that lease, that is fine. It doesn't need to be a lease that you just signed in this last calendar year. It can also be if you have an oral lease and your landlord is willing to basically put together a written lease for you right now, you can use that. And it is in the landlord's interest because if they do that, they get money. So even if you only have an oral lease, I would recommend reaching out to the landlord, your landlord, to get a written lease. You must have lost another eligibility requirement. You must have lost income due to COVID-19. That doesn't mean you actually have to have COVID-19, but you must have suffered some sort of loss of income due to it. You must be at or below 150% of the poverty line. Now there's a chart to see whether or not you qualify on the website, the link that I put up, but just to help people roughly calculate, for a household of just one person, you need to earn under $33,850 annually. For each member of increased number in the household, there's typically an increase of about $4,000 to $5,000 per person. So if a household of 2, it's about $4,000 or $5,000 more. Household of 3, $4,000 or $5,000 more than that, and so on. Again, there's a chart that you can use to actually see if you qualify, but so people kind of know offhand, that's the base qualification.
So this seems like a great point to kind of take a quick pause and reinforce some things right now. So the city has launched this rental assistance program that basically provides up to $2,500 to eligible households, and the app, which is the equivalent of 3 months rent. The application is live now and closes on Saturday at 5 p.m. So if you do not apply Saturday at 5:01 p.m., you will not be able to apply. So it's time limited. So it's important that you try as best as possible to get in contact with the city if you need assistance without having computer access through 311, or if you are computer savvy, the link has been posted in our chat and it's available in multiple languages. And I actually tried to use the language tool earlier today, and what it does, it translates the entire web page into whatever the language you select is. So if you are, let's say, using Haitian Creole, you click, the page then translates into Haitian Creole, so you have all of the information on eligibility and other resources that are available there. And the same would apply for Spanish, Chinese, and other languages. I think another important caveat is that there's a 1 application per rental unit rule. So if you live with 4 or 5 people and you are all on the same lease, that's 1 application. If you may be in a room and house situation where you each have an individual lease with your landlord, you're each considered separate households, so you can each apply individually. So that's some great information to start off at the top. Okay, can you talk us through who may not be eligible for this grant?
Yeah, so people who are not eligible for this grant are anyone who lives in public housing or gets any other governmental rental assistance, such as Section 8 through through a government program. People also who are behind rent prior to April of 2020. This program is limited to people who are having issues with their rent specifically due to COVID-19. So people who are behind in their rent already as of April 2020 don't qualify. You can also not be in the process of being evicted. One point of clarification I wanted to make is if you have signed a judgment by agreement, meaning that your landlord had took you to court, you would come to an agreement with them to pay rent plus, X number of dollars towards your back rent moving forward. And you're having trouble meeting the terms of that judgment agreement because of COVID-19, you do qualify. You can qualify for this program. So even though you can't be in the process of being evicted, if you've signed the judgment by agreement and have been making payments towards it, you are not barred from the program.
So in this context, a judgment by agreement will be considered a post-eviction process and not you theoretically being brought to court or having received a new notice to show up in court at some point in time when the courts do open for a possible eviction.
Yeah. No, yeah, thank you for phrasing that. So you go to the website, you look to over the information, and then there's a big blue button at the bottom that says apply here. Documents that you should gather before you go to do the application is a copy of your current lease signed by your landlord. And you need at least copies of 2 pages from that lease. A page that has your name, when the lease was signed, the address of the property, and the landlord's name, which that information is normally on the front page of many leases, not every lease, but normally you can find all that information on the front page. And you also need a copy of the signature page of a lease. You also need to, the website says that you need proof of income prior to COVID-19 related loss for all adult members of the household. So the 2 parts of that is, again, there's one application through household. If you're behind on behalf of you and your spouse, you need to have both of your financial information. The instructions say that you need those documents. I will say, having gone through the form myself, there's actually no place to actually upload those forms specifically, but you should have them so you have the correct numbers. And then the third thing you need is an ID that matches the name on the lease. This can be a driver's license. It can be a Philadelphia, one of the county IDs that they were issuing, passport, anything like that. It just needs the name on the ID needs to match the name on the lease. The other thing that I tried out was you can upload JPEG files, meaning that obviously we are all limited in what we have access to right now, and libraries are closed. So you can take a photo, if you have a smartphone, you can take a photo of these pages and then send them to yourself, and then you can upload those photos. You don't need to like scan and make PDFs and things like that. It seems like it will let you use a fairly wide range of document types.
So this bears repeating. In terms of documents that you would need, you need your lease, the cover page which shows who you are, who your landlord is, the address of the property or the address of your landlord, the signature page which shows that both parties have signed the lease, and you also need proof of income for all members of the household. And this is proof of income for prior to the occurrence of COVID-19. So if your last day of work was in February, then you'd get your February pay stubs and submit that to show that you are eligible for this program. And if you are someone who works hourly and you have I guess your unemployment letter or proof of what your unemployment benefits may be, you should also submit that paperwork if that's the only current proof of income that you have at this time. And of course, your ID, photo ID, needs to match the name that is provided on your lease. And it's important to know that the city is accepting all forms of identification, including municipal IDs and foreign IDs, as a part of this application process. So if you don't be worried that you don't have a Pennsylvania driver's license, use the forms of IDs that you would commonly use throughout the city, and those should be acceptable. So as we kind of go through this a little more, are there any, I know your landlord has to agree to accept the money that's coming through from the city. Are there any other restrictions or things that your landlord must agree to in order for you to receive the assistance?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. At the end of the form, it's going to ask for permission to contact people such as your landlord. Your landlord has to be willing to accept the money, which I can't believe any landlord saying that they won't, but people surprise you every day. The landlord also has to agree that they won't pursue eviction while receiving those payments plus 6 months after the last payment. So for example, if you get payments for 3 months, your landlord can evict you for 9 months, even if you have issues after those 3 months moving forward. So the program not only provides rental assistance, but also provides some protection for tenants. Your landlord has to agree to waive the late fees for April and May if at the point you get the money, they've been charged to your account. And they also have to agree to a payment plan of 6 months for any missed payments, i.e. if you were not able to pay your April rent, you will have 6 months to make that up, to be able to pay for that.
So I think it's important at this point in time to kind of reemphasize to tenants and people who are possibly applying for this program that you should make your landlord aware of the fact that you are putting in this application so that they can be on the lookout for a call from the city or an agency that's calling to verify that they are in fact your landlord and that you do live where you say you live. And also it's important that everyone knows that 6 months after the date of the last payment. Now these payments are intended to be staggered, so we can't tell you precisely when that 6 months time window will start, but that information will be communicated to you and your landlord through the agency that's handling this. But 6 months after that date, your landlord has to agree to not engage or start an eviction proceeding against you for that time period. So it does provide double protections in terms of financial support and also its own eviction moratorium for the receipt of this funds from the city. And also on that note, if you are in the process of applying and we are now in the middle of the month, it might roll around to April 1st before everything is finalized. Don't just not pay your rent to your landlord because you've done this application process. You should have that conversation and let him know. And maybe you can make a partial payment so that when the city's assistance does roll in, if you are selected through the process, that everything can coincide. So your landlord's not viewing you as a tenant who hasn't paid rent. And then the city calls him 2 weeks later and says, well, we've got this money coming to you. And he's already tried to start an eviction process against you, which he can't do right now, but may not be willing at that point in time to engage with you at that level.
Yeah. So basically, like Kadeem said, doing things to protect yourself makes sense. But like he also said in the beginning, no new evictions proceedings can start until July 10th. So you still do also have that buffer. So a couple kind of two other things that you don't necessarily need documentation about, but you should be ready to answer questions about on this form are the condition of your property and actually whether or not the landlord has been making repairs. There's a pretty extensive list of questions that goes into what kind of heat you have, is it working, what kind of stove, and things like that. And also, have you asked your landlord for repairs and are they doing it? They're also going to ask you to do, there's an affidavit section where you basically state how much income you've lost due to COVID-19 and what your new income is. You do not have to have documentation to back that up, but you do need to have some sort of number to provide them. And part of that, again, for qualifying is it doesn't need to be job loss. You don't have to have entirely lost your job due to COVID-19. If you lost hours, if you had a loss of income, you qualify. You also should be aware that nowhere on the application does it ask for your immigration status. Under our understanding is that under the current law, it won't make you an issue under the public charge rules for adjustments, but everyone should also be aware that the law is always changing and fluid. The public charge rules didn't exist a couple of months ago, so all we can talk about in terms of that is under the current law, not under what new things may come down the pike.
So Kay, that raises an important question in terms of people who are applying for the program. Are you guaranteed to receive funds if you apply for this program?
No, you're not guaranteed to receive funds. They're basically just giving it out until they're out of it. So if they have so many applications during this brief window as to overwhelm the program, that are going to engage in a lottery system at that point.
Okay. So that means that if, let's say, 5,000 Philadelphians apply, they may vote to go to a lottery system where they randomly select people who will then receive funding for their landlord for their rent payment. So it's important that you continue to check both with your agency as to whether or not your application has been approved. I know there's a 10 to 15 day anticipated window between the date that your application is submitted and the date that things are completely processed. So be mindful of the fact that it will take some time for you to hear back from the agency, depending on the volume and who applies, essentially. I think it's important to also reiterate that people who are in subsidized housing, Section 8 housing choice vouchers, HUD housing, and other forms of housings that are already being directly subsidized by the federal government and or the city are not eligible to participate in this program. If you are a recipient of a subsidy and your income has changed, we encourage you to reach out to your local housing authority, whether that be the Philadelphia Housing Authority or HUD through the federal government, and request either a hardship waiver or a adjustment of your income to reflect your current income, because this money that is being made available from the city is basically for private market rate tenants and tenants who are not already receiving a subsidy through the city. So if you have a subsidy already, you're not eligible for this program, but you can be eligible for relief through the housing authorities that you are affiliated with.
Yeah, and there are also other rental assistance programs that either have been made available again, like through OHS, or new programs that have made available. I'm dealing with it today because this is the time sensitive one that we wanted to make sure we focused on. If you need any information about other programs that, for example, you get government subsidies, if you want to see if you qualify for, you can look that up on either phillytenant.org, or you can call the Philly Eviction Project hotline, which Kadeem had said was 267-443-2500. So even if you don't get this, there are other rental assistance options that are available right now.
So just a quick recap or reinforcement of this issue. Your landlord is required to agree to accept this assistance from the city. So just because you've submitted the application, and we do encourage people to submit as complete of an application as possible. So make sure you submit your leases, your identification, and your proof of income, because this is a time-limited application window, and submitting an incomplete application could be a disqualification, because they're not going to open up the window again unless there's additional funding and the funding has not been exhausted. So if you are in the position where you have a landlord who wants to get this program and you don't have a lease, call your landlord on the phone and you guys can draft up a written lease and both parties can meet at a socially distant location and sign the lease so that you can have it to submit as a part of this program. But if your landlord does not agree to accept funding from the city, you will not receive funding from the city and you will be responsible for your rent. So Kay, really quickly before we switch gears, do you want to take us through the high points of the assistance program?
Sure. I guess number one point is applications close Saturday at 5 p.m. So be sure to fill it out through then. It will cover up to 3 months of rental assistance, which is up to $2,500. And if you don't have access to a computer, call 311. And the eligibility requirements and all of that I went through are all laid out step by step on the website. So if you missed anything I said, please check that.
That is great information for us to be aware of. So we are going to continue and switch gears at this point in time to having a conversation with Sterling, who has graciously agreed to join us at around reasonable accommodations in housing. So if you are joining us again, interpreter services are available through Zoom on the chat. So please select them if you need them. And this will also be broadcast and available at a later date in the interpretation in Spanish for people who are Spanish speakers. So at this point, Sterling, tell us what are reasonable accommodations in the context of housing?
All right, yeah, so I'm just going to give a little short outline on the issues around what are fair housing, reasonable accommodations, and then how they apply specifically to what we're dealing with right now. To just give you the overview of the type of law we're talking about discrimination law. That is the Fair Housing Act. It prohibits discrimination based on protected categories of people, based on race, color, national origin, religion, disability, familial status, and sex. In terms of the type of place of housing, we're talking about mostly all private and public housing, even places like dormitories, any apartment building, any nursing home, any type of residence. It's a very expansive definition of a dwelling. And that is the place that we are at. We are not in court. We are more about submitting complaints to administrative agencies that then can kind of allow those complaints to be heard, investigated, and then we can get a result from that. And it's important to know what discrimination is. I'm going to talk directly about this disability discrimination here, where discrimination is an intentional statement made towards a person that can be especially ugly. Using any sort of racial epithet is a classic example. Regardless, that is discrimination, and you would have a complaint. Secondly, there are rules that apply to everybody, but that there's a disparate impact on a group of people more than others. So, for example, you cannot summarily say that nobody with an arrest or a conviction can live in a place. However, you can say nobody with a felony, but people with misdemeanors. So, but you can't say summarily every single person. That would have a disparate impact against people based on their race, Black and Latinx people. You cannot say that nobody that has a disability payment can be in this place, because that has a disparate impact against people with disabilities. And then lastly, one of the most powerful parts of the law, the Fair Housing Act specifically, and then related laws on the state and local level, is the ability for people with disabilities to ask for reasonable accommodations. So there's a general rule It applies to everybody in the housing unit or apartment complex that you have, but because of your disability, you're saying that you need an exception to that rule. So it's a special carve out for this person based on having a medically recognized disability. And the parts of that process are to the actual reasonable accommodation, use those words, have the medical documentation that says that you have a disability, says that there is a connection between what you're asking for and the disability. An example is if I have PTSD, I need to connect, and that affects my major life activities, and I need a support animal, an emotional support animal that would not qualify as a pet, but it's an emotional support animal. I can ask for that. I can have medical documentation that says that this person, this pet, this animal is important for me to live my life in a fashion that is comfortable and does not create trauma for me. That is an example.
So just to do a light recap, the Fair Housing Act, as you said, prohibits discrimination on race, color, nation of origin, religion, sex, disability, and familial status. And it applies to public and private housing and nursing homes, dormitories, apartment buildings, and single family homes. So it's pretty expansive as to what it covers. And it also covers not only direct and intentional statements that may be made in relation to any of those protected groups, but it also covers statements or policies that, although on their face may not be discriminatory, as you said, the criminal restriction or the no people with criminal convictions can live in my property. But if that policy ends up having a disparate impact or disproportionate, to say it in another way, on particular groups, that can also fall within the confines of the Fair Housing Act as an act of discrimination.
That's correct.
Okay, so why are reasonable accommodations relevant in the context of COVID-19?
So they're specifically relevant due to not only people that have them, but also the people that are at risk, according to the CDC and other public health professionals, that are higher risk of contracting and also dying if they contract COVID-19. Those people may ask for reasonable accommodation due to their specific situation.
So we are, I think, aware through the CDC that minority communities and communities that are already more subject to living in poverty and having health complications prior to even being diagnosed or being affected by COVID-19 are now dying at a disproportionate rate as it relates to COVID-19. And we have also heard anecdotally that there is some experience of some form of discrimination or desperate treatment from these people in the context of their housing. So what advice would you give to a person who feels that they're being discriminated against based on the assumption that they have COVID-19 or haven't actually tested positive for COVID-19?
So when it comes to the definition of a disability under the Fair Housing Act and related state and local acts, it is fairly broad as well. It relates to any sort of impairment that has a substantially affects any major life activity. So that includes any communicable disease too, like tuberculosis or Hep C, HIV. Those are examples of disabilities under the definition under the Fair Housing Act. It also expands to anybody that is perceived as having a disability. So that is a person that does not have that disability, but that is perceived to have it and therefore is being discriminated against for having it. So if you're able to produce that evidence, person is evicting you, harassing you, even though there are no legal evictions, we know that illegal and informal evictions are occurring. If there is that, if that is occurring, and always, as I always say, there has to be evidence, and you have to be documenting these actions that are happening against you. That is a complaint. That is a complaint that can be offered in the context of the COVID crisis.
So in this context, it would be if your landlord has sent you either, let's say, an email or text message that basically says, it's been brought to my attention that you have COVID-19 and I no longer want you living in this property because you have COVID-19. Or if they may have called you and left you a voicemail that says the same thing, something that you can produce and basically show to the agencies that are taking these complaints that you are being discriminated against on the basis of COVID-19. Not that your landlord is trying to just informally or illegally remove you from the property, but you have to make the connection between your status, whether it be actually having COVID-19 or being perceived to have COVID-19, and the actual act that your landlord is trying to do at this point, which would be an illegal eviction, which is a protected activity in and of itself, meaning you can't be removed at this point based on the governor's orders and also court closures, but also there is a separate Fair Housing Act that protects you on the basis when those two things come together. So, Sterling, question for you: what agencies are taking these complaints, both locally and on the federal level?
So, for my agency, which is the Fair Housing Rights Center, we are an agency that assists with representing people in front of the administrative agencies that have investigators, and they make decisions similar to a court on whether discrimination has occurred or not. The agencies generally are HUD at the federal level, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission at the state level, and then the Philadelphia Commission on Human Relations at the city level. That is a kind of a similar agency to the Fair Housing Commission. So, but these are the three agencies that hear discrimination claims specifically. They are very important in what they can do for people. I say, at least in the way that it works in our office, it can go to the agency, and that is where a conciliation process begins. That is where we start to think about damages and money that should be paid to you because you experienced discrimination. I want people to understand this is often a long process, but the point of it is to make you whole, because to suffer discrimination is something the law takes very seriously. So you can put a monetary, you can put you can put damages, whether it's the things that you should have done, you could have done, but you were refused housing. There are all sorts of costs that go along with when you experience a discrimination. You are denied constantly on every housing application. That is time that should be repaid back to you. But the issues also in the COVID crisis and the way that it can move fast is that, and people often ignore this fact, is that if you are in a municipal court or a landlord-tenant court, having a discrimination claim simultaneously is another bargaining chip for you at that table. In the in the arbitration, in the mediation room, if there is a claim and you have evidence and it is going forward, that is a bargaining chip that you should be using constantly, especially if maybe they have a meritorious claim to evict you, but they also happen to say some very terrible things on the way out. You should be using that because and maybe even they should be paying you. That is where we are at in this space. The issues with some of our processes are that they do not go fast enough, and I've only seen them prevent the eviction in very limited circumstances, and they HUD and the state do have the power to override the judges, but they don't like to use that unless there's a very strong case. Regardless, we've seen, because the landlord-tenant cases can take several weeks. You can use the housing discrimination case as a bargaining chip, and you may even end up on top even if you lose the initial landlord-tenant case.
So I think it's important right now to reemphasize the importance of having counsel or advocates on your side, either through the Fair Housing Rights Center or the Philadelphia Eviction Prevention Project. So if you do believe that you are someone who has been treated differently or made to feel unwelcome in your home on the basis of any of the protected classes, or on the basis of COVID-19 being an actual patient or someone who's perceived to be a patient, you should connect with both of our organizations. Of course, when we post this video, we will post the numbers and links to our organizations, but the Fair Housing Rights Center can be reached at 215-625-0700, and the Philadelphia Eviction Prevention Project can be reached at 267-443-2500. So Sterling, I kind of want to shift the conversation to something that we've seen playing out both in Philadelphia, I assume, and also in the national conversation around COVID-19, because I do know that the Fair Housing Act does protect on discrimination against nation of origin. And we have seen a lot of anti-Asian American sentiment through the national conversation on COVID-19. And that kind of makes me think that not only are you protected on the assumption of COVID, but if you're being treated differently by your landlord because you may be an Asian American living in Philadelphia, that also falls within the context of the Fair Housing Rights Act. So can you talk us through any advocacy that's available? I know the courts are closed, and now is a great time to engage in that conversation and advocacy.
So overall, the courts are closed, but the Fair Housing Commission and the administrative agencies are still receiving complaints for anything that falls under the Fair Practice Ordinance. So I would say we have remained open during this period, as have you, and we are ready to hear complaints, especially when it comes to any of these issues around, especially anti-Asian sentiment. There's, and I think that there are some people that believe that they're exempt, and there are certain exemptions within the acts. But actually, an exception to the exemption is that if a person does make a statement, they are held to that, and that includes even people that are not your landlords. So that includes your neighbors. That includes some, a neighbor that's within the same apartment building, for example, would still have liability. This includes people that live next to each other in single family homes. Maybe you do not have the same landlord, or they own their own home. To make a racist statement is still a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Make any sort of graffiti or any other sign or anything, these are violations of the Fair Housing Act. I just want that to be clear. At times, there seems to be a focus on the relation between the landlord and the person. It's actually quite broad, and when it's used, it merits a lot of strength and high damages against the people that have done it, because this is a wrong that needs to be righted in our society. I think it really comes out of the late 60s when this was being done constantly. We do not see whites only signs as much as we used to, but when they do show up, they are clear violations of the discrimination laws.
So I just want to quickly point out before I reinforce that the information on the city of Philadelphia and their COVID-19 rental assistance program is Philadelphia specific, but the information on the Fair Housing Act, that's a federal law that applies to everyone living in the United States of America and its overseas territories, and protects you from discrimination on the basis of nation of origin, race, religion, sex, and I cannot remember familial status, and also if you are perceived to have a disability, whether it be a medical diagnosis or some other form of a disability that substantially impairs your ability to live your normal life, you are allowed to make reasonable accommodations requests on those bases. So it is a pretty broad law. And as Sterling does say, it not only applies to if you are a landlord with a tenant, it also governs the relationship between people who may live next to each other, people who may work. It also applies in the working environment. So it is a very broad protection. So if you are experiencing any form of discrimination on the basis of one of the protected groups, you should definitely reach out to us and we can be of assistance. And Sterling's direct line is 484-393-5512 if you'd like to speak to him directly on any of these issues and get further information. So Sterling, as we begin to wrap up, what are the major protections or high points that people should be aware of from the Fair Housing Ordinance or Act?
Yeah. So, I would like to take this time to just give a few examples of reasonable accommodations that people have asked for. Reasonable accommodation is, in its most basic form, a letter that you submit that has your disability, has your medical documentation, and then connects the accommodation to the disability. So I would like to give some examples that have been done recently. So if you are a person that you feel is at risk of contracting COVID-19, you can ask for a change to the guest policy in your home that would be really relevant in a group home. If your guest policy is changed in your like apartment complex or apartment building, you're allowed to ask for reasonable accommodation to permit home health aide to come into your space. If there is a policy like a smoking policy that you feel would put you more at risk but is not being enforced, you can ask to enforce the smoking policy in a really direct way. You can ask for there to be a delay in inspections or repairs because you believe that you're especially at risk of contracting COVID. And I think lastly, the most relevant one is if a person has contracted COVID-19 and it is affecting their ability to work, having the ability to make a reasonable accommodation to then engage in a payment plan over a space and time, that is where probably the most powerful part of the reasonable accommodation can be. We have seen where a reasonable accommodation does not allow any person with a disability to not pay because it doesn't affect the finances and income is not a protected category, but it does allow for a person to delay payments slightly based on them experiencing their disability. So having a reasonable accommodation that then requests a payment plan for a reasonable time is allowed. That is basically some of the interpretation from some of the national organizations that have been working on this for a long time. So I just wanted to give those specific examples so people know where they may apply in their own lives.
I think that's very important information and things that people may not think about, especially delays, changes to the guest policy to accommodate home health aides, because I know home health aides are also a vulnerable population in and of themselves, and they may have to travel to you and may not necessarily be a familiar household member who's already there, and also requesting a delay or a payment plan for money or income that you might have lost as it relates to COVID-19, because I guess that substantially affects your ability to live your life in a normal manner. So those protections are definitely in place. And again, the Fair Housing Rights Center can be reached at 215-625-0700. And Sterling Johnson, the Director of Enforcement, can be reached at 484-393-5512. So we have talked about a lot of information today, and I think there are two very important topics that we covered: the city's new COVID-19 rental assistance program that is now live, phillyrentalassistance.gov, I believe, which is up and running right now, so you can go and apply, and also the Fair Housing Act and those protections as it relates to COVID-19 and just generally. So in the last 2 minutes, I kind of want to give a shout out to our sponsor and the person or the group that has made this entire process possible, which is the Philadelphia Eviction Prevention Project. As you may or may not be aware, the City Council and the Mayor's Office came together in 2017, and created the Philadelphia Eviction Prevention Project with a large focus on not only preventing evictions in the city of Philadelphia, but also doing systemic advocacy around preventing the ripple effects of displacement. Right now, PEP is facing a 75% budget cut through the COVID-19 budget crisis. And we are asking individuals who have received our services, whether you have worked with us through TURN in the tenants education programs, or you have received services from the Lawyer of the Day program in the court or the courtroom navigator, or if you have been through this process without assistance and now see the value of having assistance as you navigate the court process, we encourage you to contact your city council members and advocate for this very important project that continues to help Philadelphians, especially all vulnerable tenants and others in the light of this crisis. As we know, we are able to have this conversation today and have this discussion about important issues that relates to tenants because the Philadelphia Eviction Prevention Project has seen it, and the city has seen it important to prioritize prevention of displacement as a systemic way of preventing poverty. In light of that, we just want to point out that over the last 2.5 years, we have been very successful. 95% of the tenants who we represented have been able to get successful outcomes for their families that either keep them in place or give them reasonable payment plans. And also we've been able to advocate for reasonable accommodations, as Sterling has mentioned, for tenants in the context of municipal court. So we are doing really great work, and tenants who are represented by PEP are 10 times more likely to get judgments cleared off their record once satisfied. And what that means is that while your eviction history never really goes away, it's cleared up in a context that you now look to a prospective landlord as a tenant in good standing with all of your prior landlords. It is critical that we continue to be available to do this work going forward in the coming year. Not only is eviction prevention important in the context of a family not just maintaining housing, but when you think about the fact that schools have moved to digital learning and students are now at home and more vulnerable to they won't have school to go to right now if they get displaced. So they need a place and some stability in their life where they can continue to work and get their education, and housing equals health. So if you are displaced, there are several issues that can come about in terms of health impacts, depression, anxiety, family structural changes. So to the extent that you are able, please reach out to your city council members and encourage them to fully fund the Philadelphia Eviction Prevention Project so that we can continue to be successful on behalf of tenants in Philadelphia and lift up and advocate for issues that makes Philadelphia the city of brotherly love, where we each look out for each other and where tenants can feel safe in their housing and feel that there's always an advocate on their side, provided by both the city and its partners. So on that note, I would like to thank Sterling and Kay for joining us today on our presentation. We hope you found it useful. There's a lot of information. We will post it later, both in English and in Spanish. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to contact the Fair Housing Rights Center for questions that are directly related to the Fair Housing Rights Act at 215-625-0700. They do work in the city of Philadelphia and its surrounding counties. If you are in Philadelphia and you are just facing eviction-related issues and you'd like to talk to someone through the Philadelphia Eviction Prevention Project, we are currently both working remotely, so you can contact the project at 267-442-5688 443-2500. And we thank you for continuing to join us and check in with us as we provide information that is helpful to our tenants and hopefully give people the information that they need to navigate the COVID-19 crisis. The city's rental assistance program is now live. We encourage you to apply. It closes on Saturday. And if you are experiencing discrimination, you can tune into this broadcast. It's on Facebook. It'll be on YouTube shortly, and get all the information that you need and connect with our agency so that we will be able to help you. Thanks for tuning in.